A quiet welcome to Plotfall. Tonight, our story takes us into the world of how people really went to the bathroom in medieval times. Before we begin, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find the channel. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now, find a comfortable position, perhaps dim the lights or turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Let's gently close our eyes to the bright, sterile gleam of modern bathrooms, and instead allow our thoughts to drift, soft as dust motes in a sunbeam, back through the centuries. We're journeying to a time when the flush of a toilet was a distant, unimaginable dream, a world where the daily universal call of nature was answered in ways that might seem rather earthy to us now. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet of a medieval night. The only light might be the flickering of a single tallow candle, casting long, dancing shadows on rough-hewn wooden or cold stone walls. In the corner of the room, or perhaps tucked discreetly beneath the straw-stuffed bed, sits a humble ceramic, pewter, or wooden vessel, the chamber pot. This was the most common companion for those nocturnal necessities, simple, ever-present, and waiting patiently in the dimness. Come morning, its contents wouldn't magically disappear. Oh no. Often, with a wary glance out the window to check for unsuspecting passers-by, the pot would be emptied directly into the street below, or perhaps into a designated cesspit if the household was slightly more organized. A quick splash, sometimes a shouted warning like, "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "regardez-le" or "watch out for the water," and life moved on. The air now carrying a new, pungent note amidst the everyday smells of wood smoke, animal dung, and damp earth. Even for those dwelling in grander stone castles, the solutions were robust, shall we say. The garderobe, a rather charming name for what was essentially a small room with a hole in the floor, jutted out from the castle wall. This offered a slightly more direct route for waste, often to tumble down into the moat below or a designated pit. One can only imagine the brisk, chilling air on a winter's night spent there, and the decidedly less than fragrant breezes on a warm summer's day, wafting up from the collections beneath. Privacy was frequently a secondary concern. These were functional spaces, not private retreats for quiet contemplation. Let's drift back. Far from the gleaming porcelain and scented soaps of our modern world. Imagine for a moment waking not to the gentle hum of plumbing, but to the distant crow of a rooster. The air already carrying the day's complex earthy tapestry of smells. There's no pristine private room awaiting your morning ritual, no gentle flush to whisk things away. Instead, the very concept of a bathroom as we understand it simply doesn't exist. This is a world built of earth, weathered wood, and cold stone, where the insistent call of nature was answered in ways both surprisingly pragmatic and, to our modern sensibilities, profoundly public. For the vast majority, the solution was often a humble pot, tucked discreetly under the bed or in a quiet corner of the one-room dwelling. A chamber pot, perhaps crafted from rough, unglazed pottery that felt cool to the touch, or even dented pewter if your family had a little more coin. Its contents, once filled, wouldn't magically vanish. They joined the growing collection of household waste, destined for a journey. Sometimes, this meant a quick toss out of a window. "Gardez-le," they might cry, a polite if hurried warning to any unsuspecting passers-by below, or a more deliberate trek to empty it into the street, a nearby ditch, or a designated midden heap slowly composting at the edge of town. Picture those narrow, unpaved laneways often slick with a treacherous combination of mud and refuse, the air thick with a pungent, inescapable aroma of daily life. A challenging, ever-present blend of wood smoke from countless hearths. The sharp tang of animal dung, and the unavoidable scent of human waste. It sounds rather grim, doesn't it? This constant, close proximity to the less fragrant side of existence. Yet, this was the norm, the everyday, managed with a certain, unvarnished straightforwardness, an acceptance of bodily functions that might surprise us now, cocooned as we are in our sanitized spaces. That unvarnished straightforwardness, that acceptance of the less fragrant side of existence. It truly permeated every aspect of medieval life, especially something as fundamental as answering nature's call. Privacy, as we so meticulously cultivate it today, was often a fleeting luxury, if even a common expectation, in these intimate moments. Imagine the scene. In a bustling castle, the garderobes, those stone chutes built into the thick outer walls, often venting directly outwards, might sometimes be used with less concern for solitude than we'd ever dream of. The need arose, the facility was used, and life simply continued, often without a second thought. There wasn't the same hush, the same careful tiptoeing around the subject that we might employ. Bodily functions were, well, functional. They were an inescapable part of daily existence, like eating or sleeping, and often acknowledged with a candor that might make a modern sensibility blush. The sounds were simply the sounds of necessity, perhaps a quiet rustle or a distant splash, and the smells, while undoubtedly pungent and ever present in certain areas, were just another thread in the rich, if somewhat rank, tapestry of medieval air. You might find a long bench in a monastic reredorer, the communal latrine, often cleverly built over a running stream, where monks would attend to their needs in a surprisingly open fashion. Practicality and the simple facts of biology often trumped any delicate notion of solitary contemplation. It's a world so far removed from our tiled sanctuaries and scented sprays, a quiet testament to how profoundly our attitudes towards the body and its most basic processes have shifted through the centuries. But what of the common folk, the vast majority tilling the fields and tending the livestock? For them, the call of nature was often answered with even less ceremony, a far cry from even the communal practicality of the monastery. Imagine, if you will, stepping out from your small, smoky hut, perhaps in the dim light of early dawn, the air still carrying a damp chill. There's no dedicated room, no private chamber awaiting you. Your toilet might simply be a designated patch of rough ground behind the dwelling, or perhaps a shallow, hastily dug trench a little way from the cluster of cottages, often shared with your neighbors. The air here, already thick with the smells of wood smoke, penned animals, and damp earth, would carry another, sharper, more pungent note, the undeniable scent of human waste, a constant, earthy perfume, if you could call it that, of daily medieval life. In some villages, a slightly more structured approach might involve a very basic outhouse, perhaps a rickety wooden shack with a simple hole cut into a plank, positioned over a pit. Privacy would be a luxury few could afford, or perhaps even expect. Leaves, moss, or even a handful of straw might serve for wiping, a far cry from the soft paper we take for granted. It's a stark reminder of a life lived much closer to the soil, where the boundaries between inside and outside, between the refined and the raw, were far more blurred. There was a certain, shall we say, unvarnished honesty to it all, a directness that modern sensibilities might find unsettling, but which was simply the rhythm of existence. But what if even that simple plank over a pit felt like a distant dream? For the humble peasant, whose cottage might be little more than a single earth-floored room shared with family and perhaps even a few animals, the arrangements were simpler still. Imagine stepping out from the smoky warmth of your hut, the rough timber of the door scraping softly against its frame. There might be a designated spot just outside, a patch of earth trodden bare, perhaps discreetly tucked beside a woodpile or a thorny thicket offering the faintest illusion of privacy. The air here would be a complex tapestry of smells: damp soil, wood smoke clinging to your clothes, the distant scent of livestock, and the undeniable earthy aroma of human and animal waste. In the broader expanse of the fields where you toiled from dawn till dusk, or within the shadowy embrace of the nearby forest, the world itself became your facility. A moment stolen behind a broad oak tree, its ancient bark rough against your hand, or a quick stop amidst the tall grasses, the rustling leaves your only companions. There was no flush, no running water, just the quiet absorption by the earth beneath your feet. It was a cycle, unceremonious and direct. Your contribution, as it were, would simply rejoin the soil. perhaps even nourishing the very crops you tended. A rather pragmatic form of recycling if you think about it. Born entirely of necessity. This was life stripped to its essentials, a constant negotiation with the natural world, even in its most private moments. But not every call of nature could be answered so openly, amidst the rustling leaves of the forest floor. Sometimes, particularly within the cramped confines of a growing village or near a more established dwelling, a dedicated, if decidedly unglamorous solution was sought. This brings us to the privy, a term that will become rather familiar as we explore these less fragrant corners of the past. The word itself sounds almost polite, doesn't it? Deceptively so. Imagine, if you will, stepping towards a small, often hastily constructed outbuilding. The air around it might grow heavier, more potent with each step. The privy, in its most fundamental form, could be a simple pit dug directly into the cold, damp earth. Across this abyss, a weathered wooden plank might be laid, your precarious seat. Perhaps it's worn smooth by time and use, or maybe it's still rough, threatening splinters. You'd settle there, a brief moment of solitude, suspended above the darkness, the silence punctuated only by the hum of persistent flies, or the sigh of the wind through ill-fitting boards. Sometimes, even that plank was an aspiration. It might be nothing more than the designated hole itself, a specific patch of ground where one learned to balance with care. The walls, if they existed at all, could be woven wattle, thin and offering little true concealment, or rough-hewn timber that did little to keep out the chill or the pervasive, earthy aroma. This was privacy in its most basic, almost symbolic form. A stark, unvarnished reminder of the daily dance with necessity, far removed from any notion of comfort we might hold today. And so, away from the relative cluster of the manor or village, out in the scattered farmsteads and isolated cottages, this dance with necessity took on a slightly different choreography. Here the privy, if it could be dignified with such a name, was almost invariably a separate small structure, a lonely sentinel standing a little way from the main dwelling. You might imagine a brisk, perhaps moonlit, walk across a patch of uneven ground, the night air sharp against your skin, to reach this humble edifice, the faint sounds of nocturnal creatures your only companions. The structure itself would be rudimentary, perhaps a few rough planks cobbled together, or a simple screen of woven branches offering the most meager of shields against the elements and prying eyes. Though, in the quiet solitude of the countryside, perhaps there were fewer eyes to pry. The floor, if there was one, would be cold earth, damp from the rain or morning dew, and the prevailing scent a potent, earthy mix of human reality and the slow decay of organic matter. Privacy here was less about solid walls and more about the distance from the cottage door and the general quiet of the rural expanse. It wasn't comfortable, rarely clean by our standards, and certainly not a place for lingering contemplation, especially when the wind whistled through the gaps. Yet, it served its fundamental purpose, a designated spot, set apart, where the waste of the household could be contained, however imperfectly. One wonders if the brief journey, especially on a cold, star-dusted night, with the scent of wood smoke faintly in the air, offered a moment of stark, solitary reflection, or if it was simply an inconvenient, and often chilly, interruption to the rhythms of rural life, before returning to the relative warmth of a straw bed. So what were these rural necessities actually made of? Let's picture one, standing a little way from the cottage. The wood used for its construction, if wood was used at all for the main frame or seat, would have been far from polished. Imagine planks roughly shaped by an axe, the surface coarse, still bearing the marks of its felling, perhaps damp to the touch, and smelling faintly of earth and moss. You wouldn't find neatly planed timber here. Splinters were an unadvertised feature, a small, sharp reality of daily life. For the walls, assuming there were any beyond a simple privacy screen, wattle and daub was a common sight. This was a practical, if somewhat crude, technique, a framework of pliable wooden strips, the wattle, woven like a loose basket, then plastered over with daub, a sticky concoction of wet soil, clay, perhaps some straw or animal dung to bind it. The texture would have been uneven, bumpy, drying to a hard, earthy shell that offered some protection from the wind, though it might crumble a little with each passing season, releasing a dusty, organic scent. And if you were lucky, truly fortunate in the grand scheme of medieval comforts, your little outhouse might boast a roof. This would likely be a small cap of thatch, bundles of straw or reeds, layered to shed the rain. On a blustery day, you'd hear the wind sighing through it, or the soft drumming of raindrops, a small sound in the vast quiet of the countryside. These were structures of necessity, fashioned from what the land readily provided, simple and often stark. But what happened to the contents of that humble privy, or indeed the waste from chamber pots emptied in the chill morning air, their contents arcing briefly before splashing onto the ground? Often it wouldn't travel very far. Just a short walk from the back door, perhaps nestled against a low stone wall weathered by countless seasons, you'd find the dung heap. This wasn't merely a repository for the byproducts of your livestock, the gentle steaming mounds from cows releasing a warm bovine scent, or the sharper tang of chicken droppings. No, your own contributions, collected with varying degrees of care, would frequently join this earthy, ever-growing pile. Imagine the scene. A sprawling, dark, almost breathing mound, often damp, glistening with moisture in the weak sunlight or under a sliver of moon. Its texture would be uneven, a mix of straw, food scraps, and the unmentionable, slowly compacting under its own weight. The air around it would be thick, a complex, strangely vital perfume of ammonia, decaying vegetation, and rich, damp earth. The very essence of life breaking down to begin again. Flies would certainly be constant companions, a low, persistent hum their summer song, their iridescent bodies glinting. This heap, so uncomfortably close to where you ate and slept, wasn't just waste, it was future fertility, a potent, if pungent promise of nourishment for the very fields that would, in time, feed your family. There's a certain stark pragmatism to it, a blunt acceptance of natural cycles, however unsavory the intimate details might seem to our modern sensibilities. So, having considered the larger cycle of waste, that pungent heap so vital to the land, we turn to the more intimate act of personal care. With no neatly perforated squares to hand, what did our medieval ancestors reach for? The answer, as ever, lay in what the earth and their immediate surroundings provided, often with a texture and sensation quite unlike anything we might imagine today. Imagine, if you will, the rustle of leaves in a nearby copse. A broad, pliable leaf, perhaps from a sycamore or a mallow plant, could be plucked and used, its surface cool and perhaps a little waxy against the skin, carrying the faint green scent of the woods. Or consider the deep, yielding softness of moss, gathered from a shaded stone wall or the damp floor of a forest. This natural sponge, smelling faintly of earth and green-growing things, would offer a surprisingly gentle touch, a small cushion of wild comfort. For those in more agricultural settings, a handful of hay or straw was always close by. Less luxurious, certainly, perhaps even a little scratchy and coarse against sensitive skin, its dry whisper a constant rural sound but undeniably functional. And then, for a more permanent solution, there was the humble stone. Not just any stone, but one chosen for its smoothness, often water-worn from a riverbed, into an obliging shape. This stone, cool and solid in the hand, could be used, rinsed, and kept for the next occasion. A strangely personal implement, sometimes even shared within a household, carrying a silent history of countless, quiet moments. There's a stark simplicity to these solutions, a directness born of necessity, a reminder of a world deeply intertwined with the raw materials at hand. Now let's shift our gaze, very gently, from those quieter, more pastoral settings, to the burgeoning towns and cities of the medieval period. Here, the simple solutions of the countryside quickly became overwhelmed, a quiet problem swelling into a communal concern. Imagine, if you will, the narrow, winding streets, not always paved with charming cobblestones as we might picture, but often just compacted earth, slick with mud and, well, an assortment of other discarded things. The air itself would have carried a different weight, a complex, almost tangible perfume of wood smoke, animal hides from the tanner, the scent of baking bread perhaps, all underscored by the ever-present, inescapable aroma of human waste. It was a daily reality, as common as the cry of a street vendor. In these more densely populated areas, dealing with the daily necessities grew considerably more complex and often more challenging. For those dwelling in grander stone buildings or castles, a garderobe might offer a modicum of privacy. This was essentially a small stone-built room, or even just a seat, projecting outwards from the main wall, with a hole leading directly downwards. Often this shaft emptied into a moat below, or into a specially dug cesspit at the base of the walls. A rather drafty affair, certainly, especially on a cold night, and one that didn't magically make the problem disappear, merely relocated it a short distance. Some larger, more organized towns did attempt to establish public latrines, sometimes thoughtfully built over rivers or streams, letting the current carry away the evidence. A solution that, while practical for the town, merely passed the issue downstream. But for many ordinary townsfolk, the humble chamber pot remained the primary receptacle. Its contents, once full, were then faced with the dilemma of disposal. Often this meant a quick toss out of a window into the street gutter below, or perhaps into a nearby ditch or stream, sometimes accompanied by a shouted warning of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, if the person was feeling considerate. The concept of a coordinated underground sewage system, as we understand it, was still centuries in the future, leaving these growing urban centers in a constant, fragrant, and often losing battle with their own daily refuse. And so, that fragrant battle raged on, particularly fiercely in the burgeoning towns and cities. Here, where timber-framed houses leaned companionably close, their upper stories sometimes almost kissing across narrow, winding lanes, the simple toss-and-shout method quickly transformed from a mere personal inconvenience into a truly formidable collective environmental challenge. The sheer density of life, each household contributing its daily share to the unpaved earth below, meant that the streets often became shallow, treacherous rivers of mud and muck, thick with discarded food scraps, wandering animal droppings, and, yes, the relentless, almost tidal, contributions from countless chamber pots. Imagine, if you will, attempting to navigate such a thoroughfare, perhaps on your way to the market square. Your every step would be a calculation, a cautious placement of feet to avoid the worst of the mire. The air itself would be heavy, a complex, inescapable tapestry of smells. The comforting aroma of wood smoke from hearths, perhaps fresh bread from a nearby bakery, the earthy scent of livestock, but always, underpinning it all, the pervasive, sharp, and deeply unsettling tang of human and animal waste. Some larger, more ambitious towns did attempt to grapple with this overwhelming tide, establishing public latrines, sometimes rather grandly called garderobes, if attached to a significant building, often built to overhang rivers or streams. This was, of course, a direct and rather indiscriminate transfer of the problem downstream. Others relied on communal cesspits, large, brick-lined pits dug into the ground, essentially buried problems which, while containing the immediate mess, presented their own uniquely aromatic and logistically nightmarish challenges when they inevitably, and often quite spectacularly, filled. So beyond the private solutions the chamber pots emptied with a shout from an upper window, and the somewhat optimistic river-dangling garderobes attached to grander homes, some towns did indeed try to offer a more communal approach to this most basic of human needs. Imagine, if you will, cautiously approaching such a place. It might be a long, rough-hewn wooden bench, perhaps with several unadorned openings, perched somewhat precariously over a deep, dark dugout pit. Or it could be a more solid, moss-stained stone structure jutting out purposefully over a sluggishly flowing river, the murky water below serving as a natural, if entirely indifferent, disposal system. These public conveniences weren't exactly beacons of modern privacy. Often, they were quite open air, exposing users to the biting wind, the drizzle of rain, and the casual, perhaps averted glances of anyone passing nearby. At best, they might possess a rudimentary, leaky roof to keep off the worst of the snow or sun. Forget individual stalls or scented candles. Picture instead a shared, almost companionable experience, though perhaps not one you'd eagerly anticipate or linger over. The very air itself would often tell you that you were approaching, a heavy, cloying sweetness mingling with something sharper, more acrid, a scent that worms its way into your memory. The upkeep, as you might already be picturing with a slight frown, was, well, let's just say it varied wildly and often leaned towards the grim. A well-maintained public latrine, perhaps one benefiting from a consistently swift river current, or, more rarely, regular clearing by dedicated and undoubtedly hardened individuals, might have been a tolerable, if not exactly pleasant, necessity. But many, tragically, were not so fortunate. They could easily become fetid, overflowing monuments to municipal neglect. The ground around them saturated and treacherous, the air thick enough to practically chew. A constant, buzzing cloud of flies would be their only loyal, and perhaps only enthusiastic, attendants. The pervasive smell would permeate the damp wood or cold, slimy stone, a permanent, unwelcome signature of their rather unfortunate purpose. It's a rather sobering thought, isn't it? That such a simple daily act could be fraught with such an intense, and frankly rather stomach-turning sensory assault. So, after that rather pungent image of the public facilities, you might be yearning for a slightly less communal experience. And for some, a degree of privacy was indeed attainable, a small comfort in a world often lacking in personal space. Imagine, if you will, a townhouse, perhaps a merchant's dwelling, pressed tightly against its neighbors on a bustling, cobbled street, the air thick with the smells of commerce and daily life. If they had the means, and a precious sliver of land to spare at the rear, a private privy offered a significant step up from the public ordeal we just contemplated. This wouldn't be a grand affair, not by any stretch of our modern imaginations. You might find it tucked away at the far end of a narrow walled garden, perhaps where a few tenacious herbs valiantly fought for sunlight amidst the shadows cast by tall, leaning buildings. Or it could be in a cool, damp corner of a small, moss-slicked courtyard, the kind that rarely saw the sun. Picture a simple wooden shed, its timber weathered to a silver gray by countless seasons of rain and wind, or a slightly more robust, though still modest, stone outbuilding. The air around it, while certainly not perfumed, would carry a fainter, less aggressively public scent of human waste, perhaps mingling with the damp earth, the distant aroma of wood smoke, or the faint fragrance of those struggling garden plants. Inside it would be cool, probably a little gloomy, the only light filtering through a small, high opening or the cracks in the wooden planks. The only sound might be the distant, muffled hum of the town, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, or the soft creak of the door as you sought a moment's solitude. A simple hole, a rough-hewn wooden seat perhaps, a profound sense of seclusion. A luxury, really, in its own medieval way. A quiet testament to a bit more silver in the purse, and a desire for some small, personal dignity. But for many, especially as darkness fell or the biting winds of winter howled like mournful wolves outside your poorly insulated walls, venturing to even the closest privy was an unwelcome, shivery prospect. And so, we turn our gaze inward, to an object of truly profound, if somewhat humble importance, the chamber pot. This was the unsung hero of the medieval knight, the stalwart companion during bouts of sickness, the simple answer when rain lashed down in icy sheets, making any outdoor excursion a misery. Imagine the scene. The fire in the hearth has dwindled to a soft orange glow, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, and a deep, penetrating chill seeps through the wooden shutters or the gaps in the wattle and daub. Tucked discreetly beneath the heavy wooden bed, or perhaps standing ready in a shadowy corner, was the chamber pot. Crafted from practical, coarse earthenware for most, perhaps a dull, serviceable pewter for those with a little more coin, or even gleaming silver in the grandest households, its form was usually simple. A wide-mouthed bowl, often with a sturdy handle, sometimes graced with a lid, though this was more a polite suggestion than an effective barrier against the escaping odors that would inevitably mingle with the common medieval sense of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and damp wool. In the dead of night, when the floorboards were cold enough to steal the breath from your bare feet, or when fever left you too weak to rise from your straw-stuffed mattress, this humble vessel offered a necessary, if unglamorous, convenience. The cool, smooth surface of the pot against tired skin would be a sharp sensation in the surrounding stillness. It was a very personal, very immediate solution to a universal need, an intimate part of daily, or rather nightly, existence for almost everyone, from peasant to prince. The contents, of course, faced a less private fate come morning, often a swift dispatch into the nearest street or ditch, a fragrant contribution to the medieval town's already rich tapestry of smells. A grim thought, perhaps, but the chamber pot itself was a small, essential comfort in a world that wasn't always gentle or forgiving. And these essential comforts, these nightly companions, were far from uniform in their appearance. Picture, if you will, the array of vessels that serve this most universal of needs. Many were crafted from humble pottery, their surfaces perhaps a little rough to the touch, cool and earthy. These were the workhorses, sturdy and unadorned, easily replaced if broken, a practical solution for a practical problem. You might imagine the faint scent of damp clay clinging to a newer one, or the smooth, worn feel of one that had seen countless nights. Others, belonging to households with a little more coin to spare, might be fashioned from pewter. These would have a different character entirely, heavier in the hand, with a dull silvery sheen that might catch the flickering candlelight. They felt more substantial, a small touch of permanence in a transient world. The pewter might be smooth, almost silky, or perhaps bear the minor dents and scuffs of daily life, each mark a tiny story, a testament to its nightly service. And then there were the truly surprising examples. For even in the quiet intimacy of the bedchamber, status found a way to express itself. Some chamber pots were not merely functional but surprisingly ornate. Imagine delicate glazes, intricate painted designs, perhaps even a family emblem proudly displayed. A touch of artistry lavished on an object, destined for such an unglamorous task. It's a curious thought, isn't it, that even here, in this most private of moments, the subtle, or not so subtle, signals of wealth and standing were present, a silent testament to a world keenly aware of its hierarchies. These vessels, humble or grand, held more than just waste. They held a reflection of the lives that used them. But what became of these vessels, these intimate containers, once their morning duty was done? As the first hesitant rays of dawn filtered through the grimy, leaded glass of a medieval window, or perhaps just an open shutter, it signaled the start of another, rather pungent, daily ceremony. Imagine, if you will, the sounds that might accompany this moment: the creak of a door, the shuffle of feet on a rough wooden floor, and then the telltale slosh. This was the hour of slopping out. From countless homes, humble and grand alike, the contents of those chamber pots would begin their unceremonious journey. With a practiced flick of the wrist, out it would go, a stream arcing briefly through the cool morning air before landing with a splash in the central gutter, or onto the cobbled, or more often, dirt-packed street below. Sometimes a shout of "Gardez-vous," that famous anglicized warning from the French "Regardez-l'eau," watch out for the water, would echo down the lane, a fleeting courtesy in a world less concerned with public niceties. More often, perhaps, there was just the sound. The narrow laneways, already a tapestry of mud, animal droppings, and discarded scraps, would receive this fresh offering. This communal tide, a murky, odorous concoction, would then sluggishly make its way towards a designated cesspit, if the town was organized, or simply towards the nearest stream or river, carrying the town's collective secrets with it. It paints a rather stark picture, the stark reality of urban life, where the personal met the public in the most unvarnished of ways, every single morning. One can only imagine the layers of scent that define such a place, a constant, earthy reminder of life's most basic functions. And so, this daily tide, this collective exhalation of the town, began its unhurried pilgrimage. It didn't always find a neat, well-engineered sewer to spirit it away. More often, it trickled into the rudimentary gutters that traced the edges of the bustling, narrow streets. These weren't the clean, covered drains we might picture today. Oh no. Think more of shallow trenches, sometimes just depressions worn into the packed earth, or perhaps crudely lined with uneven stones, looking more like accidental features than planned infrastructure, patiently awaiting their daily contributions. These channels became the reluctant carriers of an astonishingly rich and undeniably fragrant mixture. Rainwater, when it fell, would attempt a flushing, but often it merely swelled the existing contents, stirring the settled dregs into a more potent slurry. Household slops. The murky water from washing, scraps of forgotten vegetables, perhaps the greasy residue from a pot, or even the blood from the butcher's stall just up the lane, would all join the human effluent. It was a slow-moving, opaque stream, a public repository for private discards, meandering its way through the very heart of daily life, a constant visible signature of the community. You might imagine yourself stepping carefully along the slightly raised center of such a lane, should one even exist, the air already thick with the smells of wood smoke, animals, and cooking, now carrying an extra, pungent layer from these open drains. The sound, if any, would be a gentle, almost reluctant lapping against the stones, or the occasional squelch, as some unfortunate soul misjudged their footing. It was an unavoidable presence, these little rivers of refuse, a darkly humorous testament to the sheer, unvarnished reality of medieval urban living, flowing silently past thresholds and under the very noses of passers-by, day after day. And oh, that air, under those very noses! It wasn't just the subtle, yet persistent whisper from those open drains that composed the daily perfume of a medieval town. Imagine, if you will, drawing a deeper breath. As you venture further, each inhalation would bring a symphony of smells, a complex tapestry woven from the very fabric of life, a potent signature that no handful of scattered herbs could ever truly conceal. The sharp, almost eye-watering tang from a distant tannery, where hides soaked in less than fragrant concoctions might drift on the breeze, mingling with the earthy, sometimes sweet, sometimes sour aroma of decaying vegetable scraps from a market stall nearing the end of its day. Close by, a blacksmith's forge could contribute the metallic bite of hot iron, and the distinct, slightly sulfurous scent of burning coal, a dry, almost gritty note against the damp, organic smells permeating the narrower alleys. Then there were the more domestic, though no less pervasive contributions. The thick, comforting, yet sometimes choking, perfume of countless hearths burning wood or peat, a scent that would cling to your clothes, your hair, a constant companion. This would layer with the close, heavy scent of unwashed humanity in crowded quarters, perhaps mixed with the fainter, mustier smell of old straw bedding, itself a miniature ecosystem. It was an olfactory landscape, rich and unavoidable, a constant, often overwhelming reminder of the raw, unfiltered nature of medieval existence, where every activity, every trade, every living being left its indelible, aromatic mark. From that complex tapestry of everyday aromas, let us now lift our gaze, and our senses, upwards, towards the imposing stone walls of a medieval castle. Here, amidst the perceived grandeur and defensive might, different solutions for nature's calls were engineered, at least for the lords, ladies, and their immediate households. These weren't the communal latrines of a bustling town, but something a little more architecturally integrated, if not always fragrant. Imagine, for a moment, finding such a place. You might pass through a heavy wooden door into a small, often narrow chamber, built directly into the thickness of the castle's formidable outer wall. This was the garderobe. The air here would be cool, the stone surfaces smooth and perpetually chilly to the touch, echoing faintly with the castle's distant life. Often, a simple wooden seat, perhaps softened with a scrap of fabric for the very wealthy, was positioned over a vertical shaft. This chute, sometimes lined with stone, plunged downwards, often quite dramatically, towards the murky waters of the moat below, or a designated cesspit at the foot of the unyielding walls. A brisk, and sometimes surprisingly strong draught might whistle up from the depths, a constant chilling reminder of the void beneath and the ultimate destination of all things. The name itself, garderobe, hints at a rather quaint, if slightly optimistic dual purpose. It literally meant warding the robes, as these small rooms were sometimes used to store valuable garments. The theory, perhaps born more of hopeful observation than rigorous science, was that the pungent ammonia fumes wafting up from the pit below would deter moths and other fabric-munching pests, so your finest silks and woolens might hang just a few feet from where daily necessities were discreetly, or perhaps not so discreetly managed. A rather practical, if aromatically challenging, approach to pest control and personal relief, side by side in the cold stone. So while your clothes might have been nominally protected by those rising fumes, the primary function of many a garderobe was far more fundamental. Imagine, if you will, a very small, very stark room, often no more than a tiny alcove jutting out from the formidable stone face of the castle. Or perhaps it was a narrow passage, carved directly into the immense thickness of the outer wall itself, a little pocket of chilly privacy in the otherwise bustling and often crowded medieval fortress. There wouldn't be much in the way of comfort here, no soft furnishings or gentle lighting, just cold, unyielding stone. The throne itself was usually a simple wooden plank with a hole, or sometimes just a shaped stone slab, positioned directly over a vertical shaft. This shaft, a long, dark drop, would channel everything downwards, away from the interior living spaces of the castle. As you sat there, you might feel a distinct chill, a constant, sometimes mournful draft whistling up from below, a reminder of the sheer drop and the elements just outside. Through the opening, if you dared to peer, you'd glimpse the dizzying distance to the ground far beneath, or perhaps the murky, opaque waters of the castle moat swirling sluggishly. It was a strikingly direct, if somewhat exposed, system. The final destination for all this was often a simple, unceremonious pile at the base of the wall, or a specially dug cesspit, a collecting point for the castle's organic refuse. One can only imagine the unenviable and profoundly fragrant task of the gong farmer, whose job it was to periodically clear these potent collections, usually under the discreet cover of darkness. For the castle dweller, however, the garderobe offered a moment of relative solitude, a brief escape, with the wind as your primary companion and the vast, indifferent landscape stretching out below, if the opening even allowed such a view. A practical solution, certainly, born of necessity, if not exactly the height of refined luxury. So let us linger for a moment on the garderobe itself, that curious little annex. Picture, if you will, stepping into a very small, often narrow chamber, built directly into the formidable thickness of the castle wall. Sometimes, it was little more than a projecting stone box, an architectural afterthought clinging, perhaps a little precariously, to the sheer face of the fortress. Inside, the air would likely carry a persistent chill, even on a warmer day, a coolness seeping from the heavy, unadorned stone that formed your tiny, private enclosure. The light, if any, would be meager, filtering through a narrow slit window meant more for ventilation than illumination, or perhaps just the faint light from the opening below. Your seat, often a simple, well-worn wooden board, or a less forgiving carved stone aperture, was positioned directly over that infamous chute. There was no intricate flush, no complex network of pipes, just the unwavering pull of gravity and a long, dark drop to the moat or cesspit. You might feel a distinct draft whispering up from the depths, a constant sighing reminder of the void just beneath you, sometimes carrying with it faint, ambiguous sense from the world outside, or the collection point far below. Imagine hearing the distant, mournful cry of a bird, or the rustle of wind through the unseen trees, sounds that briefly connected your very solitary, very human moment to the vast, indifferent landscape stretching beyond the stone. A truly elemental experience, stripped bare of all pretense, offering a stark, undeniably efficient solution to an unavoidable daily ritual. And this stark efficiency, this pragmatism, often extended beyond personal relief to the very architecture of defense. The placement of these garderobes, these necessary stone outcrops, was rarely an afterthought. Castle builders, masters of stone and strategy, would frequently position them to jut out directly over the castle's defensive ditches, or the often stagnant murky waters of the moat, where gravity could lend its inevitable assistance. Imagine, if you will, the scene from below, especially on a still, humid day. A potential attacker, perhaps cloaked in the damp pre-dawn mist, trying to find a weakness in the towering stone. They might have braced for arrows, for boiling oil, for the sudden clang of alarm bells, but what they might not have fully anticipated was the sudden, unwelcome cascade from above, or the persistent miasmic aroma that clung with a stubborn embrace to the base of the walls in certain sections, a truly potent, if entirely unintentional, deterrent. It's a darkly humorous detail of medieval life, this olfactory shield. The very air around a besieged castle could carry more than just the scent of wood smoke or damp earth. It often carried a very human, very potent warning, especially downwind. This wasn't merely about hygiene, such as it was, though it did conveniently deposit waste away from the immediate living quarters. It became an incidental, yet perhaps surprisingly effective layer to the castle's formidable defenses, a silent, odorous guardian of the stone ramparts. One wonders how many assaults were subtly discouraged, or at least made significantly more unpleasant, not necessarily by the gleaming threat of steel or the daunting height of the walls alone, but by the simple, profoundly pungent reality of what accumulated just beyond the stone, a constant, silent testament to everyday life within. A rather earthy form of psychological warfare, wouldn't you say? Now, if you were a person of some standing, a lord or lady perhaps, or even a well-to-do merchant with a stone house, you might have access to something a little more refined, or at least a little more private. This was the garderobe, essentially a small, stone-built room, or perhaps a chamber cleverly jutting out from the main wall. Inside, a simple seat, often just stone or wood, was positioned over a hole, which opened into a chute. This chute, in turn, would deposit its contents down the side of the building, often into a moat, a river, or a specially designated cesspit far below. It was undoubtedly a step up in terms of personal space from the more communal options. No need to queue in the cold, no awkward hushed conversations over the sounds of, well, nature taking its course. But let's not paint a picture of serene, spa-like comfort. Imagine, if you will, stepping into this narrow stone recess on a blustery November night. The wind, a constant companion in stone castles, would find its way in, whistling through any arrow-slit window or, more unpleasantly, sometimes gusting straight up the chute itself. A persistent, chilling draft would cling to you, seeping into your bones as you sat. The stone walls, unheated and unforgiving, would radiate a damp cold, and the seat, however smoothed by use, offered little comfort against the pervasive chill. And then there was the aroma. While the chute was designed to carry everything away, a capricious gust of wind, blowing in just the wrong direction, could send a rather unwelcome olfactory reminder wafting back up. Depending on the castle's design, the season, and indeed the diligence of those tasked with cleaning the area below, your private moment might be accompanied by a fragrance that was anything but discreet. Perhaps a scattering of sweet-smelling herbs on the floor was your only defense, a fragile, fragrant shield against the lingering medieval miasma. So while it offered a modicum of dignity, the garderobe was still a stark reminder of the era's limitations, a private space that was often bracingly, uncomfortably real. And once your solitary contemplation amidst the drafts and distant sounds was complete, the question of personal tidiness arose. It wasn't a world of soft, perfumed paper, neatly perforated and waiting. Oh no, your options were considerably more rustic, shall we say, and perhaps a little humbling to consider from our modern vantage point. Sometimes, hanging within reach by a coarse rope, you might find a piece of sea sponge, or perhaps a bundled scrap of linen or wool. Imagine grasping that, the sponge likely cool and still slightly damp from its last use, perhaps shared, rinsed in a bucket of water that you'd sincerely hope was changed with some regularity. It was a communal solution in many instances, a far cry from our private rituals, and one that carried its own subtle, earthy aroma in the enclosed space. Failing that, a bundle of rags, old, torn remnants of clothing, their purpose now reduced to this final essential task, might be stuffed into a nearby recess in the stonework. Their texture would vary wildly, from the surprisingly soft whisper of well-worn linen to the uncomfortably coarse scratch of rougher wool. Or, in many a more modest setting, it was simply hay or straw. Dry, a little scratchy against the skin, perhaps smelling faintly of the stable or the distant fields, it was the most basic of provisions. You'd reach for a handful, its brittle stems rustling softly, a tiny sound in the otherwise quiet of the stone chamber. Whichever was available, the act of cleaning oneself was a swift, functional affair, a brief, tactile postscript to the main event. It's a small detail, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, but one that paints a more complete, and perhaps slightly less fragrant, picture of daily existence. A quiet reminder that comfort, as we understand it, was a luxury yet to be widely invented, and that even the most private moments were shaped by the raw materials of the age. But amidst this widespread improvisation, where convenience often wrestled with basic hygiene, there were pockets of surprising order, havens where necessity and ingenuity quietly coalesced. We mustn't forget monastic life, those often sprawling complexes dedicated to prayer, diligent work, and a surprisingly structured approach to even the most mundane daily needs. Here, in the quiet discipline of the cloister, the latrine, or reredorer as it was often called, was frequently a far more considered affair, a testament to a different way of thinking. Picture, if you will, a long, often stone-built gallery, perhaps a little cool to the touch, even in summer. It might be impressively engineered to sit astride a diverted running stream or a specially constructed channel, the water a constant, gentle murmur below. Imagine stepping into such a space. The air, while not fragrant, might carry the cleaner scent of damp stone and flowing water, noticeably less pungent than the chaotic streets you left behind. Rows of simple wooden seats, perhaps worn smooth by time and use, and sometimes separated by modest partitions for a sliver of privacy, would line one or both walls. Below, the faint, persistent gurgle of that flowing water would be your companion, a constant cleansing current designed to carry the community's waste away with a certain efficient grace. This was a level of communal sanitation, a thoughtful design, that was quite remarkable for its era. It wasn't luxury, not by our modern measure with its gleaming porcelain, but it represented a significant, almost thoughtful step up from the haphazard and often fragrant solutions found elsewhere, a quiet nod to the monks' resourcefulness and their quest for a more controlled, perhaps even slightly less earthly existence. Indeed, this careful arrangement of the reredorer, or necessarium as it was sometimes known, the necessary place, speaks volumes about a different approach to life. Imagine, if you will, stepping into this long, often stone-built structure. The air, while certainly not perfumed with roses, would likely be a marked improvement on the general miasma of a medieval town, thanks entirely to that diligent, ever-flowing stream beneath. You'd see a row of simple, perhaps wooden, seats, often separated by low stone or wooden partitions, creating individual cubicles without the luxury of doors. Privacy, as we understand it, was a rather more fluid concept then, a communal affair in many aspects of life, this one included. The sound of the rushing water below would be a constant companion, a natural, almost soothing white noise, perhaps intended to muffle other less desirable sounds of human biology. It was a place of undeniable necessity, certainly, but also one of remarkable order, reflecting the disciplined, regimented life of the monastery itself. There might have been a draft, a chill from the stone, especially on a damp winter morning. Perhaps there was a quiet, almost stoic dignity to it, a shared, mundane ritual performed in the silent or softly murmuring company of brothers. A brief, functional respite from solitary prayer or laborious work in the fields or scriptorium. The rough-hewn wood or cold, smooth stone beneath you. The distant echo of a chant from the chapel, the ever-present gurgle of the cleansing stream. It all formed an integral, if often unremarked, part of the daily monastic rhythm, a quiet testament to ingenuity in an age of pervasive grit. Now, if you were a monk or a nun, your daily visit to the necessarium, as it was often called, might have been a slightly less challenging affair. Within the cloistered walls of a monastery or nunnery, a different standard often prevailed. It wasn't luxury, mind you, not by a long stretch, but there was a discernible commitment to order, a striving for cleanliness that set these places apart from the more haphazard arrangements found elsewhere. The monastic orders, with their strict routines and emphasis on discipline, often extended this meticulousness to their latrines. Imagine, if you will, a long stone-built structure, perhaps with a series of individual wooden stalls, still quite basic, but regularly swept. The air, while never entirely free of its essential purpose, might have carried less of the sharp, eye-watering ammonia tang that clung to so many other medieval spaces. Instead, perhaps the scent of damp stone, dried herbs occasionally strewn, and the constant, soothing murmur of the water channel doing its diligent work below. This dedication wasn't born from a modern understanding of germ theory, of course. Rather, it stemmed from a deep-seated belief in purity, both spiritual and physical, and a practical need to maintain health within a close-knit community dedicated to prayer and labor. These reredoors, or garderobes, were often ingeniously sited over flowing streams or purpose-built channels, ensuring a more efficient and continuous cleansing than the stagnant pits common elsewhere. So while still a far cry from a scented porcelain throne, the monastic privy offered a small, yet significant measure of relative comfort and hygiene in a world that often seemed to revel in its own grime. A small island of managed sanitation in a vast muddy ocean. Indeed, for some monastic orders, particularly those with a considerable wealth and the engineering know-how, think of the Cistercians, renowned for their mastery of water management. This idea of flowing water wasn't merely about selecting a convenient downstream location. They actively engineered it, coaxing nature to serve their needs for cleanliness. Picture, if you will, a channel, meticulously carved from solid, cool stone, or perhaps constructed with robust, dark timber, diverting a significant portion of a nearby lively river or a clear, fresh spring. This wasn't a haphazard trickle, but a steady, reliable stream, guided with deliberate, almost reverent purpose. This engineered current would flow directly beneath the long, often communal, row of seats in the reredotor, a constant, gurgling, cleansing presence. You can almost hear it now, can't you, even through the centuries? The gentle, persistent lapping and murmur of water, a sound so utterly different from the buzzing cloud of flies and the grim, oppressive silence that would have characterized a less fortunate, more common privy. The air here, while certainly not perfumed with summer meadows, would have been noticeably fresher, the usual potent miasma of human waste significantly diluted, carried away on the moving current. This continuous flow, a cool whisper through the stone structure, would transport waste far more effectively, sluicing it down into a larger river well downstream, or perhaps into a carefully managed soak-away system, far from the delicate noses within the hallowed monastery walls. It was a remarkably sophisticated system for its time, a testament not just to monastic order and ingenuity, but a quiet, watery blessing in an otherwise often stagnant, pungent world. A small, flowing victory against the ever-present grime. But not everyone lived within the ordered walls of a monastery, nor possessed a castle with its own jutting garderobe. For the prosperous merchant, the minor noble, or the well-to-do artisan living in a bustling town or a comfortable manor house, a different kind of private convenience existed. This was the domain of the close stool, a rather more civilized affair, all things considered, and a distinct step up in domestic comfort. Picture, if you will, a sturdy wooden box, perhaps crafted from dark, polished oak or smooth, pale pine. It might be quite plain, its beauty in its utility, or it could bear simple carvings, even a touch of inlaid work, a subtle testament to the owner's status. Lift the lid, and nestled within, you'd find a removable pot, typically made of earthenware, pewter, or sometimes even silver for the truly extravagant. The true luxury, however, was often the seat itself. This wasn't just a hole cut into wood. It was frequently padded, sometimes covered in soft leather, a piece of rich tapestry, or a cushion stuffed with wool or horsehair, offering a degree of comfort that was worlds away from a cold stone slab or a splintery plank over a pit. This was, in essence, your personal, portable privy. It could be discreetly placed in a bedchamber, perhaps behind a screen for added modesty, or moved to a warmer spot near the hearth in winter. No more shivering dashes through drafty corridors in the dim hours before dawn. You could even imagine the faint, hopeful scent of dried herbs, Rosemary, perhaps, or lavender, sometimes scattered within the pot, or kept nearby in a pomander, a small, fragrant defense against the inevitable. The closed stool offered a quiet, contained solution, a little pocket of personal space in a world that often afforded very little. Of course, once used, its contents didn't magically disappear. The less fragrant and decidedly less dignified task of emptying the chamber pot fell to a servant, a quiet, daily reminder of the hierarchies that underpinned even the most personal of human rituals. Indeed, that unseen labor was the silent, often unthanked, counterpart to the relative comfort the close stool afforded its owner. This wasn't merely a bucket tucked away in a shadowy corner. It was a deliberate piece of furniture, sometimes crafted with surprising care and even a touch of artistry. Imagine a sturdy wooden box, perhaps fashioned from plain, solid oak in a modest home, or more ornately carved and polished in the chambers of the wealthy. It featured a carefully cut hole in its top, an invitation to sit, and a hinged lid, a small but significant innovation that kept things discreet, both visually and, one hoped, olfactorily. Lift that smooth wooden lid, and nestled within, concealed from casual view, you would find the familiar ceramic or metal chamber pot, or a dedicated pail, ready to perform its humble duty. It was the medieval era's answer to a very modern desire for a modicum of privacy and immediate convenience, a distinct step up from the often drafty and public garderobe, or the simple chamber pot left somewhat vulnerably exposed. You might picture one standing quietly in a bedchamber, perhaps beside a heavy tapestry that did little to truly warm the cold stone walls, its wooden seat surprisingly cool to the touch on a misty morning. This clever concealment, this unassuming boxy throne, was a clear forerunner to the fleshing commodes we barely think twice about today. Each soft creak of its lid, each careful placement of the pot within, was a small, quiet act in the long, slow, and often rather fragrant drama of human sanitation, a testament to our enduring quest for a little dignity in life's most basic and universal functions. But that quest for dignity, for a touch of refinement, didn't stop at mere concealment for everyone. Oh no! For those with wealth, those whose chambers already gleamed with polished wood and rich hangings, the close stool itself could become an object of surprising luxury, a statement piece almost. Imagine, if you will, not a simple wooden box, but a carefully crafted piece of furniture, perhaps fashioned from dark, fragrant cedar or sturdy oak, its surfaces smoothed and waxed to a gentle, almost liquid sheen in the dim light. The seat, far from being a chilly plank, might be generously padded and upholstered in fine fabrics. Picture velvet, deep and soft to the touch, its nap cool at first, then warming, in hues of rich burgundy or a shadowed forest green, held in place with lines of gleaming brass tacks like tiny, loyal soldiers. Or perhaps a sturdy, patterned wool, even silk brocade for the truly ostentatious, its intricate, hand-stitched designs. A hunting scene, a floral flourish, catching the flickering candlelight. The lid, too, would be a work of art, often heavy, sometimes padded and covered to match, or intricately carved with a family crest or a delicate geometric pattern. It would close with a quiet, muffled thud, a soft finality. These weren't just functional, they were signals of status, carefully integrated into the domestic landscape of the affluent, a rather plush throne for life's most private rituals. A velvet cushion for a very earthy task, a curious, almost poignant blend of opulence and inescapable biology, a testament to the persistent human need to beautify even the most basic of needs. But even the most beautiful of close stools, with its velvet and carvings, shared a common, less glamorous destiny with its humbler cousin, the simple chamber pot. The contents, a stark, earthy reminder of that inescapable biology, didn't magically vanish with a flush, as we might imagine today. This often thankless and undoubtedly pungent task fell to a servant, a familiar, if often unseen, figure in the daily rhythm of a noble household. Theirs was the responsibility to ensure discretion, to make this necessary process as invisible and inaudible as possible, a silent ballet of waste disposal performed in the shadows. Imagine the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, the castle or manor house still wrapped in a fragile slumber, or the deep hush of late evening after the fires have died low. A soft scraping sound, perhaps, as the heavy earthenware or metal pot was carefully lifted from within its grand wooden housing, the lid carefully replaced. Then the servant's careful, almost silent tread through dimly lit passages, avoiding creaking floorboards, or across cold, unforgiving stone floors, carrying their odorous burden. The air, already thick with the everyday smells of wood smoke, damp rushes, and perhaps the faint metallic tang of armor, would gain another, sharper, more insistent note. The final destination was usually a designated cesspit, a deep, often brick-lined pit, tucked away in a quiet corner of a courtyard or garden, sometimes perilously close to wells or other water sources, a detail that would often have grim, unseen consequences for the health of the household. Or, in more sophisticated setups, it might be a stone-lined drain, a medieval attempt at plumbing, hopefully channeling the waste away from the immediate vicinity of the grand hall or the private solar. A quiet splash in the darkness, a brief, perhaps resigned sigh from the servant, before the pot was wiped or rinsed, ready once more for its noble, if fundamentally earthy purpose. So the deed was done, the pot emptied, hopefully somewhere downwind. But what then? For personal tidiness, we've touched on the resourceful use of what nature provided: soft moss, perhaps still cool and damp from the forest floor, or broad, pliable leaves gathered from nearby trees. For many, this was the everyday reality, a direct, earthy connection to the world around them, even in this most private of moments, a far cry from the scented, quilted squares we barely think about today. But for those with a little more means, or perhaps simply access to discarded textiles, scraps of old cloth offered a touch more, refinement, if we can call it that. Imagine a piece of linen, perhaps once part of a well-worn tunic or a sheet that had seen better days, now finding its final purpose. It would be softer than a handful of straw, certainly, though likely still coarse by our modern standards. Its weave perhaps a little uneven, bearing the history of its previous life in its threads. These weren't luxurious purpose-made items, but rather fragments of a household's fabric life, repurposed until they were truly beyond any other utility. These linen scraps, varying in size and the thinness of their wear, might be washed and reused. A frugal practice born of sheer necessity in a world where fabric itself was a valuable commodity. Picture the rough texture against the skin, perhaps the faint, almost clean scent of lye if they were indeed laundered thoroughly, or, more commonly, just a slightly musty human odor if they were simply aired out between uses. It's a small detail, this piece of cloth, yet it speaks volumes about the daily textures and the constant, unglamorous cycles of medieval life, a world where every resource was precious, and true comfort, as we understand it, was a relative, often hard-won concept. The idea of disposable softness was a distant dream, many, many centuries away. Now, if the idea of those endlessly reused linen scraps feels a little too intimate for your modern sensibilities, let's cast our minds back even further, to the Romans. They, in their grand public latrines, had a rather different approach, one that speaks of a certain pragmatic, if somewhat unsettling, communal spirit. Imagine, if you will, the tersorium asterisk, a natural sea sponge, surprisingly soft and pliable when wet, affixed to the end of a simple wooden stick. This was the Roman equivalent of toilet paper, more or less. After use, this communal implement wouldn't be discarded, of course. Instead, it would be rinsed, not in continuously fresh running water, as we might desperately hope, but typically in a shared bucket filled with strong salt water or sharp acidic vinegar. You can almost smell the faint, tangy brine mingling with other, less savory odors. Feel the damp, slightly gritty texture of the re-wetted sponge. One can only ponder the brief, perhaps slightly awkward exchanges, as the tersorium was passed or retrieved from its cleansing bath among strangers. Did this curious device vanish entirely with the fall of Rome? It's difficult to say with absolute certainty for every remote village or isolated monastery across the medieval world. Sponges, after all, were still harvested from the warm waters of the Mediterranean. In regions that once felt Rome's direct touch, or perhaps in wealthier, more eccentric households with a lingering penchant for older customs, It's conceivable that a version of the tersorium persisted. Picture a solitary sponge on a stick, perhaps kept discreetly in a private chamber pot room, rinsed in a personal bowl of vinegar, a faint, marginally more hygienic echo of its bustling Roman ancestor. It's a quieter, more personal affair, yet still a world away from our own expectations of solitary, disposable cleanliness. The thought itself is a gentle reminder of how profoundly our most basic daily rituals have transformed. So the deed is done, as it were. The immediate, shall we say, aftermath has been addressed with varying degrees of thoroughness, depending on where and when you found yourself in this sprawling medieval tapestry. But what of the hands? Our modern reflex, almost instinctual, is to reach for soap and water, a cleansing ritual deeply ingrained. Back then, however, the connection between unseen germs and illness was a mystery yet to be unraveled, a concept that simply didn't shadow daily life. For many, a quick wipe on a rough-spun tunic, or perhaps a splash of cold water from a communal barrel if one was conveniently nearby, might have been the extent of it. Water itself was often a precious, laboriously hauled commodity, not to be used frivolously. Imagine the sharp chill of it on a frosty morning, drawn from a village well, the water perhaps smelling faintly of damp earth and stone. The idea of dedicating much of this vital resource to simply washing hands after every visit to the garderobe or chamber pot wouldn't have been a universal priority, especially when there was firewood to chop or a meager stew to simmer. The wealthier echelons of society, naturally, often lived by different, more visible standards of cleanliness. In a stone-built manor or a bustling merchant's house, you might well find a servant presenting a ewer, a decorative jug, perhaps silver or patterned ceramic, filled with water, alongside a basin to catch the runoff. This water might even be lightly perfumed, with distilled rose petals or lavender, a subtle fragrance mingling with the coolness. A piece of linen, not always soft but certainly separate from everyday garments, might be offered for drying. This was as much about social grace, a display of refined living, as it was about cleanliness in a way we'd recognize. Yet, even here, the true microbial understanding of hygiene was utterly absent. The water cleansed what was visible, offering a comforting, if ultimately superficial, illusion of purity in a world where true sanitation remained a distant, almost unimaginable dream. It's a gentle reminder that even the most personal acts were shaped so profoundly by the knowledge, or lack thereof, of the time. That comforting illusion of purity, however thin, was built upon a reality where even the most basic element, water, was a hard-won treasure. For many, perhaps most, water didn't simply appear with the turn of a handle. Picture it, the daily, sometimes hourly, pilgrimage. You might trudge to a communal well, its stone lip worn smooth by countless hands and ropes, the air around it damp and echoing with the creak of the windlass. Or perhaps your path led to a nearby river, its surface reflecting the gray sky, its waters carrying silt and secrets from upstream. Each bucketful was a victory, a small, cold weight against the effort of drawing it up or scooping it out. Feel the rough wood of the pail handle digging into your palm, the slosh of the contents as you carefully navigate uneven ground, trying not to spill a precious drop. This wasn't a quick dash to the sink. It was a significant investment of time, of precious human energy. So when you think about washing, truly washing, understand that every single splash was considered a full-body immersion in warm, clean water, a distant dream for most, reserved for the wealthy or the very occasionally indulged. Even rinsing hands thoroughly after using the garderobe or chamber pot would have been a careful, measured act. The water used might be shared or saved for other, less personal tasks, its cleansing power diminishing with each subsequent use. This profound scarcity shaped everything, turning what we now see as a simple, almost unconscious act of hygiene into a daily calculation of resources, a constant awareness of limitation. With every grim offering from the garderobe, every slosh from an emptied chamber pot, the unavoidable question loomed, where did it all accumulate? For a vast number of homes, businesses, and even castles, the answer lay directly beneath their feet, or very nearby, in the unglamorous reality of the cesspit. Picture, if you will, a deep hole purposefully dug into the uncomplaining earth. Sometimes these were just raw, earthen pits, vulnerable to seepage. Other, more considered constructions might feature a lining of rough stone or brick, a subterranean container designed to hold the collective waste of a household or a neighborhood. The air around them, especially on a still, damp day, would carry an unmistakable pungent heaviness, a constant olfactory reminder of what lay hidden. These weren't tucked away in some distant, forgotten corner. They were often startlingly close to daily life, in courtyards, beneath kitchens, or even within the foundations of buildings themselves. Over time, these pits would slowly, inexorably fill, a silent, unseen accumulation. The thought of one overflowing, or its contents leaching into the ground, and perhaps, most alarmingly, into the precious well water, was a genuine and unpleasant concern. It was a system born of necessity, a direct and rather earthy solution to an ever-present problem, a hidden, fermenting layer beneath the cobblestones and floorboards of the medieval world. This method, while common, was a testament to the era's straightforward, if somewhat perilous, approach to sanitation. And so, as the seasons turned, these hidden repositories, tucked away beneath the bustle of medieval life, would inevitably approach their limits. The air around them might grow heavier, a subtle, earthy warning before the more obvious and unpleasant signs of an overburdened system. This was the uncomfortable truth. What went down must eventually be brought back up. It was a problem that couldn't simply be wished away, a silent, odorous countdown happening just beneath the cobblestones and floorboards. When that critical time came, a particular kind of specialist was called upon. Known by various names, nightmen, rakers, or the rather blunt gong farmers. These individuals undertook what was undeniably one of the least desirable, yet most essential jobs imaginable. Often, they worked under the quiet cloak of darkness, perhaps to spare the daytime sensibilities of the populace, or simply because the streets were clearer then for their grim cargo. Their task was heralded not by trumpets or fanfare, but by an intensifying of an already potent local aroma, a sure signal that the depths were about to be disturbed. The process itself was one of sheer, unglamorous labor. Armed with long-handled scoops, sturdy buckets, and perhaps a rickety cart waiting discreetly nearby, they would begin the painstaking extraction. Imagine the scene, if you will. The flickering light of a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows, the thick, viscous slurry resisting every pull of the scoop, the air heavy with fumes that would test the strongest stomach and cling to clothing for hours. This was not a task for the faint of heart, nor for those with a delicate sense of smell, yet it was performed, load by laborious load, until the pit was finally emptied, ready to begin its silent, unseen service once more. A testament to a recurring cycle of necessity in a world still grappling with the very basics of public hygiene. But who, you might wonder, undertook this deeply unpleasant yet utterly vital task? These were the gong farmers, a rather euphemistic title, or more plainly, night soil men. Their world began when yours, as a medieval town dweller, was ending, cloaked in the deep velvet of the night. They moved through the darkened, silent alleyways, their footsteps muffled on the cobblestones, or perhaps the soft squelch of mud underfoot, guided by the dim, flickering glow of a lantern. Imagine them, perhaps a father and son, or a small, tight-knit crew, their faces partially obscured by rough spun cloth tied against the overwhelming odor. The air, even in the supposedly fresh night, would carry the signature tang of their profession, a scent that clung to them like a second skin, marking them out in daylight hours, often leading to social ostracization despite their essential service. Their tools were rudimentary, sturdy wooden buckets, lengths of rope, a stout shovel, and if they were more established, a rickety cart pulled by a weary horse, its own breath misting in the chill night air. The work itself was backbreaking, a relentless scooping and hauling from the reeking depths, transferring the waste to barrels or directly onto their cart. Each bucketful, heavy and viscous, was a testament to the city's hidden burdens, destined for designated dumping grounds often far beyond the city walls, or sometimes, controversially, into nearby rivers if regulations were lax or ignored. And the dangers were very real. Suffocation from the noxious fumes, the dreaded gong itself, was a constant threat, a silent killer lurking in those confined spaces. Cesspit walls, old and poorly maintained, could crumble, a sudden terrifying collapse. It was a grim trade, essential yet often reviled, performed by those who walked the night to keep the day even remotely habitable. So picture these night soil men, the gong farmers, as they navigated the slumbering city under the hushed mantle of night. Their work truly began when respectable folk were deep in their slumber, the narrow streets and alleyways cloaked in an almost tangible darkness, broken only by the hesitant, flickering glow of their own lanterns or torches. The usual silence of the late hours would be punctuated not by revelry, but by the rhythmic, heavy slosh of their burdens, the dull scrape of wooden shovels against stone or compacted earth, sounds that few would willingly pause to hear, let alone investigate. This was a profession steeped in more than just physical filth. It carried with it a profound social stigma, a task deemed utterly necessary, yet performed by those often dwelling on society's quiet, unseen margins. The very air around them would have felt thick, an almost visible miasma composed of everything the city discarded, clinging stubbornly to their rough-spun clothes, their hair, their very skin. It's a challenge for us, in our sanitized world, to truly conjure the sheer, overpowering, and inescapable nature of that smell, a constant acrid assault on the senses. Yet, within this olfactory nightmare, they toiled on. Imagine them descending into those cramped, lightless pits, the only illumination a dim, smoky torch casting long, dancing shadows on slimy, sweating walls. Every bucket load painstakingly hoisted, heavy and reeking, was a small, hard-won victory against the relentless tide of urban squalor, a truly Herculean task performed with the most rudimentary of tools. Their contribution, though utterly unglamorous and profoundly unpleasant, formed a thin, fragile, yet absolutely vital line, holding back an even greater, more pestilent tide of disease and discomfort for everyone else who called the city home. So what became of all that arduously collected material, the dense and potent result of the gong farmer's toil? Well, it wasn't simply discarded into the nearest convenient ditch or river, at least not always, and certainly not all of it. A significant portion, known rather euphemistically as, quote, night soil, embarked on another, perhaps slightly less overwhelming, journey once removed from the concentrated confines of the cesspit. Imagine those rickety wooden carts, now laden with this dark, earthy cargo, trundling slowly out of the city gates, perhaps under the dim light of early dawn, their wheels groaning a soft, rhythmic complaint on the uneven tracks leading away from the sleeping town. This wasn't mere disposal, you see. It was an early, unglamorous form of recycling, born from pragmatism and a deep, if perhaps unspoken, understanding of the Earth's needs. This night soil, surprisingly rich in the very nutrients plants crave, nitrogen, phosphorus, was in its own way a valuable commodity. It would be transported, sometimes over considerable distances, to the surrounding farmlands. There it was sold, or perhaps traded, to farmers desperate for any advantage that might coax a more generous harvest from their often tired, overworked fields. Spread carefully across the land, it would slowly release its potent essence, replenishing the very soil that grew the grain and vegetables destined to return to the town, thus closing a rather pungent, but undeniably vital, loop in the medieval world. A quiet, earthy alchemy, turning waste into sustenance. While some waste, as we've heard, was carefully collected and returned to the earth in that quietly cyclical way, a far more common and considerably less curated fate awaited much of the daily refuse from burgeoning towns and bustling cities. If your settlement was fortunate enough, or perhaps unfortunate enough, to be nestled beside a flowing river, or even a modest stream, then congratulations. You had what many considered a ready-made, ever-flowing waste disposal system. Or so the rather optimistic thinking went. The logic, in its own grimly pragmatic way, was seductively simple. The current would carry it all away, out of immediate sight, and therefore optimistically out of mind. For a while, at least. Try to picture it now, as you drift. Imagine standing on a somewhat precarious wooden bridge, the timbers damp beneath your feet, or perhaps peering from a narrow, unglazed window that directly overlooks the water. The river, which in a more pristine age might have been a source of clear, sweet water for drinking or for the day's washing, now presents a vastly different and far more troubling character. Its surface, instead of reflecting the clear sky with a joyful sparkle, might carry a sluggish, opaque film. It's a disquieting, slowly churning mosaic of human and animal detritus, the soggy remnants of kitchen scraps, and the often noxious cast-offs from various riverside trades, the tanner's eye-wateringly pungent leavings, the dyer's unnatural, vivid hues bleeding like fresh wounds into the current. The smell, especially on a warm, still day, or when the water levels were low, would have been an almost physical presence, an olfactory assault, a complex, deeply unpleasant miasma that would cling to the damp air, seeping into the very stones and timbers of riverside dwellings. And yet, this was the pervasive backdrop to daily life, to commerce unfolding on the riverbanks, to children, perhaps, still attempting to play nearby, to people drawing water a little further upstream, fervently hoping, perhaps even quietly praying, that sheer distance offered some small measure of purity. The river, a vital artery of trade and life, was simultaneously, and quite starkly, an open sewer, a flowing, murky testament to the era's pressing, and often overwhelming, sanitary challenges. A constant, liquid reminder of the proximity of life and its less palatable byproducts. This constant, liquid reminder of life's less palatable byproducts. This riverine highway of waste, of course, didn't just conveniently disappear into the earth or evaporate into the ether. No, it journeyed onward, a grim, flowing legacy passed from one settlement to the next. Picture, if you will, the communities nestled further down its course, their own lives intrinsically tied to these same waters. They too would gaze upon the river, perhaps with a similar mixture of necessity and unease, knowing, or perhaps simply suspecting, what it carried from upstream. The concept of germ theory was centuries away, a distant dream of future understanding. So when the water drawn from the river, water for drinking, for cooking that thin, gloopy stew, for washing the grit from tired faces, brought sickness, it was often attributed to ill humors, bad air, or divine displeasure. Yet the true culprit was often the water itself, now a murky soup of human and animal waste, a breeding ground for diseases that could sweep through a village with terrifying speed. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These were the unseen passengers on that relentless current, turning the river from a source of life into an unwitting agent of suffering and premature death for so many who relied upon its tainted embrace. The gentle lapping of the water against the bank could, in reality, be the quiet herald of another wave of illness. The miasma theory, the idea of bad air carrying sickness, seemed so logical then, didn't it? Especially when the air itself often hung heavy with the cloying, almost sweetish scent of decay and unmanaged waste, a constant, unwelcome companion in densely packed towns and even smaller villages. Imagine, if you will, the quiet dread that would settle over a household, heavy as a damp woolen blanket, when the first signs of a raging fever or a twisting gut appeared. The desperate hope would then be placed in herbal poultices and boiled concoctions, their earthy, sometimes sharply pungent aromas filling a small, dim room, mingling perhaps with the faint metallic tang of blood or the sharp, sour smell of persistent sickness. They saw the relentless fevers, the debilitating weakness that left strong men frail, the agonizing cramps and fluxes of dysentery that seemed to empty life itself from the body. They heard the desperate, whispered prayers and felt the chilling, familiar grip of loss, over and over again, season after season. The sheer, overwhelming reality was that these devastating illnesses were frequent, unwelcome visitors, guests who always overstayed their welcome and invariably left a trail of profound sorrow and empty spaces at the hearth. Yet, the invisible link, the microscopic chain connecting a carelessly emptied chamber pot upstream or a poorly dug latrine seeping into the well to the sickness gripping a child downstream, remains stubbornly, tragically obscure. It wasn't for a lack of caring or a deliberate disregard. but a profound, almost unbridgeable gap in their understanding of the world. They battled the visible symptoms with what they knew. They mourned the countless dead with deep sincerity, and they prayed fervently for the bad air to clear, never quite grasping that the very water they drank, the soil beneath their feet, was so often the silent, unassuming source of their deepest, most recurring woes. This constant, unseen threat was simply a grim thread woven into the very fabric of medieval life. That unseen threat, that grim thread of disease, was indeed woven deeply. But beyond these pervasive dangers, let's gently turn our thoughts to the simpler, daily acts, the ones often overlooked in grand historical narratives. Consider the very human need to relieve oneself. How did privacy, as we understand it, feature in this most personal of moments? For many of us now, it's almost sacred. A locked door, a quiet, solitary space. But journey back with me and you'll find a rather different landscape of personal boundaries. If you were truly fortunate, perhaps a person of considerable means, your stone dwelling might have offered a garderobe. Imagine a small, jutting chamber, little more than a seat built into the thick wall, overlooking a dizzying drop to the moat or a designated pit far below. A persistent, chilly draft would likely be your constant companion there, a faint, earthy smell mingling with the cool air from outside. Or, within your private chambers, a close stool, an ornate wooden box perhaps, with a padded seat and a concealable pot, offering a more dignified solitude, the rustle of heavy tapestries, the only sound beyond your own thoughts. For the vast majority, however, such considerations were a distant echo. Communal latrines were a common feature in monasteries, bustling towns, and even within the less grand fortified homes. Picture, if you will, a long, often stone-built structure with a row of openings, sometimes with only the thinnest of wooden partitions, or none at all. The air might be thick, with the murmur of conversation, the sounds of daily life continuing unabated around you, a truly shared experience. And then, of course, there was the ever-present chamber pot, tucked away perhaps beneath a straw mattress. Its contents, often with little ceremony, would join the detritus of the street below, a daily, sometimes hazardous, contribution to the urban mire. It paints a picture, doesn't it, of a society where the lines between public and private were drawn in a very different, much fainter ink. This openness, this casual acceptance of functions we now deem intensely private, wasn't just a feature of daily life. It bubbled up into their stories, their art, even the dry pronouncements of their laws. Imagine, for a moment, the hushed rustle as you turn the stiff vellum pages of a medieval manuscript. Amongst the pious images and meticulously copied text, your eye might catch a tiny, almost whimsical drawing in the margin. A little figure, perhaps quite unconcernedly using a latrine, sketched with an everyday frankness that can feel startlingly immediate. And their literature, those narratives spun aloud in echoing halls or painstakingly transcribed by flickering candlelight, certainly didn't shy away from the more visceral aspects of human existence. Popular tales, like some of Chaucer's, could pivot on a moment of surprising, even startling bathroom-related humor. A misdirected posterior, a strategically aimed pot. These weren't just crude jokes for a less refined age, but perhaps reflections of a world where such things, while still ripe for a hearty communal laugh, were an undeniable part of the shared human comedy. Even the more formal legal records, with their careful script on aging parchment, might detail disputes over the precise location of a privy, or the rather stern penalties for unsanctioned waste disposal into a neighbor's garden, or the already burdened street. These brief mentions paint a surprisingly vivid picture of community standards, of daily negotiations around shared space and, yes, pervasive olfactory offenses. It all points to a society that, for all its hardships, possessed a certain unblinking, earthy engagement with the full spectrum of life, one that might make our modern sensibilities blush, or perhaps just quietly marvel at their different perspective. That different perspective, that unblinking engagement with the earthier side of life, wasn't a monolithic block across medieval Europe. Far from it. The sheer expanse of the continent, stretching from the windswept, rocky coasts of the north to the sun-baked plains of the south, naturally fostered a diverse tapestry of sanitary solutions. each subtly shaped by the climate and what the land itself offered. Imagine, for a moment, the biting chill of a stone garderobe in a northern fortress. This was essentially a small room, often jutting out dramatically from the castle wall. The wind would whistle through the narrow opening, a constant chilling companion. The seat itself, usually a simple hole cut into a stone or wooden plank, would have been unforgivingly cold, especially on a frosty morning. Below, a long, often perilous drop to a moat, a cesspit, or simply the ground outside the walls. Now, travel south in your mind, to a sunnier, perhaps more densely populated village. Here, you might find communal latrines or simpler individual outhouses tucked away at the edge of a garden. These could be modest timber structures, their wooden planks weathered silver by sun and rain, the air within thick with the scent of dry earth, perhaps a hint of lime, and the unavoidable, pungent aroma of human waste. The constant hum of flies in warmer months would have been an ever-present soundtrack to this daily necessity. Local materials, from readily available timber and thatch to more enduring stone in wealthier or strategically important locations, dictated much of the construction. And local customs, too, played their part, influencing whether facilities were private, semi-private, or starkly communal. It was a landscape of pragmatic adaptation, a far cry from any standardized approach, each solution a quiet testament to the ingenuity, and perhaps the resignation, of people facing a universal daily challenge. And so, this tapestry of makeshift solutions, of timber, stone, and sheer necessity, wasn't static. Not entirely. Across the vast, unhurried expanse of the medieval centuries, tiny shifts did occur, like water slowly shaping stone. A monastery perhaps might refine its latrine system, digging a deeper pit, or cleverly diverting a small stream for a more effective, though still rudimentary, cleansing flow. Such an improvement, however modest, would have been a significant local luxury, a small pocket of slightly less pungent air. Imagine a prosperous town, growing a little too quickly, its narrow lanes increasingly burdened not just by people and animals, but by what they left behind. Here a new town ordinance might appear, a hopeful, often ignored, piece of parchment, urging citizens to perhaps wait until after the morning market rush before emptying their chamber pots from an upstairs window. A small courtesy, a tiny nudge towards order in the fragrant chaos, rarely achieving widespread compliance, but showing at least an awareness, a burgeoning desire for something better. These were ripples, not waves, small, localized acts of trying to manage the unmanageable, to civilize the inherently earthy aspects of daily life. The grand, sweeping vision of coordinated public sanitation, of hidden networks silently whisking away a city's collective secrets beneath your feet, that remained a dream, locked away in a future still many, many generations distant. For most, life continued amidst the familiar, pervasive sense and the daily dance of avoidance. The idea of a bathroom as a private, clean, almost sterile space, well, that would have been as fantastical to them as a griffin, and probably far less likely to be a topic of polite conversation. Instead of that gleaming, tiled sanctuary we imagine, the medieval world offered a rather more earthy collection of solutions, each with its own name, a testament to how people tried to frame this most fundamental of needs. These weren't just words. They were attempts to categorize, perhaps even to dignify the often undignified daily ritual. Each term offers a slightly different window into the era's approach to what was, after all, an inescapable part of being human. Consider the privy, a term that whispers of seclusion. You might picture a small, solitary wooden hut, perhaps tucked away at the bottom of a frost-covered garden, the rough-hewn door creaking softly in the breeze. The air within, however, would likely carry the sharp, unmistakable tang of its purpose, a constant reminder of its function. Then there was the garderobe, a rather grander-sounding affair, often a small chamber or stone closet jutting out from formidable castle walls. Its name, curiously hinting at wardrobe, came from the rather optimistic belief that the potent ammonia fumes rising from the pit far below would deter moths and other pests from any garments stored nearby. A fragrant, if not entirely effective form of pest control. The more common folk might speak of the, quote, trout, a straightforward, no-nonsense term for a basic latrine, perhaps little more than a weathered plank over a dugout pit, exposed to the elements. Or you might hear of the necessary house, a wonderfully euphemistic phrase, isn't it? A gentle linguistic cloak thrown over a very necessary, very universal, and often very pungent reality. Each name, from the slightly more formal latrine, often found in the disciplined confines of monasteries or bustling military camps, to the humble jakes, paints a subtly different picture. These weren't places of quiet contemplation as we might know them today, but simple, functional answers to an unavoidable call of nature, their very names an echo of a world trying to find a polite way to talk about the inherently impolite. And so as you rest now, perhaps in the quiet stillness of your room, let the sounds of the modern world fade into a gentle hum. It's from this place of warmth, this cocoon of contemporary comfort, that we can truly begin to appreciate the vast chasm separating our daily experiences from those who lived centuries before us. We seldom pause to consider the intricate systems that support our lives, the silent choreography of pipes and sanitation that whisk away discomfort with such effortless grace. A simple flush, a clean basin, the very air we breathe, largely unburdened by the pervasive odors of less managed times. When we turn our thoughts to the medieval era, and specifically to something as fundamental as going to the bathroom, it's almost like peering into an entirely different dimension of existence. The conveniences we barely register, privacy, readily available water, the absence of a pervasive, ambient stench in our towns and cities, these would have been unimaginable luxuries. Thinking about this, truly feeling the contrast, it's hard not to experience a quiet surge of gratitude. A gentle acknowledgement for the often unseen, unthanked engineering and societal shifts that allow us the simple dignity of modern hygiene. It's a profound difference, isn't it? One that highlights just how much our baseline for comfort has shifted, and how much we truly have to be quietly thankful for. Indeed, it is a profound difference, a chasm of experience separating our daily lives from theirs. And so, with that quiet understanding settling in like dust motes in a fading sunbeam, we gently close this particular chamber door on medieval sanitation. It's a subject often relegated to the footnotes of history, perhaps understandably so, given its less than glamorous nature. Yet to tiptoe around it is to miss a fundamental, almost primal layer of their existence, a truth that underpins so much of their daily struggle and resilience. Imagine, just for a moment longer, the lingering sense of wood smoke, damp earth, and something altogether less pleasant, fading now as we withdraw from that world. Picture the rough-hewn textures against skin, the persistent chill that seeped through thin walls even on a summer's eve, the constant subtle negotiation with the very ground beneath their feet, a ground often saturated and yielding. These aren't just quaint, distant details, they are the very fabric of daily life, the unacknowledged, ever-present backdrop against which every other historical drama, every personal joy or sorrow unfolded. To overlook these earthy realities, the endless, wearying battle against mud and waste, the pervasive odors that clung to clothing and hair, the sheer physical effort of maintaining even a semblance of cleanliness in a world without effortless running water, is to see only a partial, somewhat romanticized picture of the past. This fundamental aspect of life, this daily, unglamorous yet profoundly human routine, shaped their world, their health, and perhaps even their outlook, in ways we can only begin to appreciate from our comfortable, sanitized distance. It's a quiet reminder that history is lived in the mundane as much as in the monumental, in the privy as much as in the palace. Thank you for joining us on Plotfall. Until our next story, may your thoughts be calm and your rest deep.